1460 WVOX.
Now, live from Whitney Media, 1460 WVOX, the Greenberg Report, with Greenberg Town Supervisor Paul Feiner. You can join in the conversation at 914-636-0110. Now on 1460 WVOX, here's Greenberg Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Good morning, Westchester. I'm Paul Feiner. I'm the Greenberg Town Supervisor, and today we have a really interesting program. My guest is Susan Seal, and we're going to be discussing her efforts to preserve the Odell House and turn the Odell House into a museum. The Odell House is located on Ridge Road in Greenburgh, and it played a very significant role in the United States becoming the United States. And Susan, could you just tell us a little bit about the Odell House?
Well, you started with the most important thing. There was a decision made in that house in 1781 between General Rochambeau, the commander of the French forces, and General George Washington that they would take all their troops and march to Yorktown, Virginia. Well, we all know what happened in Yorktown, Virginia. That was where Cornwallis was defeated and the American Revolution was won. The original plan, when they came to Greenberg, had been to attack the British in Manhattan, because everybody always thought, oh, that was the way to win the war. But after they spent 6 weeks walking around, riding around, they realized, oh, the British had a lot of troops and this was not going to work. And the French Navy said they would only come as far north as Yorktown, Virginia. And then the two generals made this decision, and they snuck, literally without the British knowing, 7,000 troops across the Hudson River over the course of 4 nights. And the British never caught on, and they marched to Virginia. So this is why the house is so important.
Do you think that this house is important nationally? Like for historians, would they say the Odell House has very significant national?
Absolutely, Paul. Absolutely. I think that the story of the French and the American alliance is really important nationally and internationally. In fact, we have much interest from French government officers and private citizens who want to be involved with this, because it was actually the first time the United States had an international cooperation. Forces fought together, and it was really significant. So nationally, it's very significant. New York, a third of the battles of the Revolutionary War took place in New York. I don't think anybody teaches that in the schools.
Well, when you first started this effort, the property was not owned by the town of Greenberg. Could you tell us about your efforts to get the property turned over to the town?
Well, I'll try to make it short. It's actually a 22-year story. But we moved to Rochambeau Drive, and we thought, why is this named for a French general? And then my husband was out in the garden, and he dug up a musket ball. And we said, oh, wait, something significant happened here. So then I started really investigating it and realized how important this area was, the troops that were camped in Greenberg, all the history. And then I saw this boarded up house, and I thought, oh, wait, this has to be open to the public. And it took a long time to get the effort going, but Paul came in and said, okay, I'm going to make the brave move that the municipality will take ownership of this property and work to create a museum, which is a big undertaking, and I'm very proud that we were able to do that.
Right, and I remember bicycling on Ridge Road, and it was boarded up, and I always saw a French flag, but it was never maintained.
No, it was falling apart. There were holes in the roof. Everything was going to be lost if you hadn't taken it over.
Right. We have to take a break, and after the break, we'll talk a little bit about the Friends of the Odell House, Rochambeau headquarters, and what people could do if they want to get involved in preserving history for future generations to appreciate. I'm Paul Feiner, Town Supervisor.
Now back to the Greenberg Report on 1460 WVOX, Once again, here's Greenberg Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Good morning, I'm Paul Feiner, and we're talking with Susan Seal about the historic Odell house. And Susan, could you just tell us what the website of the Friends of Odell House is?
Absolutely. It's odellrochambeau.org, which is very easy. And our email is the same. It's odellrochambeau@gmail.com. So if anybody would like to contact us for more information or to join or to donate, very easy to find us.
And I should mention that the website is so interesting. I was looking at it last night, and I forgot that this house was built in 1732.
1732, 1760, 1785, and 1855. What is amazing about this house and unique is that it was never updated. It's there in its original condition. There's no heat, there's no plumbing, nobody plastered over the original walls, so it is just waiting to be a museum. It's intact, and it was filled with all the possessions and furnitures of the Odell family for 200 years.
And it's interesting, on your website, you mentioned when John Tompkins, resident of Eastchester, built the first dwelling in 1732, he wrote that the house in Greenburgh was surrounded by friendly Native Americans.
Yes, that's one of our research projects right now, is to try and find out more information about the Native Americans.
So could you just give us like a little history of the house again?
History of the house. Okay. So John Tompkins was the first person. Then there was another English descendant, the Bates couple, Gilbert and Sarah. They owned it through the Revolutionary War, and she was a widow in 1781, and she's the one who offered it to the Count de Rochambeau as his headquarters. After the war, it was sold to Colonel John Odell, who was one of George Washington's guides, and his family, his descendants, lived in it until 1990. So that's really unique to have a house that only had 4 owners in over 250 years.
Do you know how much the price was when the first Odells bought it?
Yes, actually, John Odell had saved money from his bonus as a guide, and he paid £600 for the land, which he bought from the commissioners of forfeiture who had taken it away from the loyalist Frederick Phillips. And I think he paid somewhere around £200 for the actual house.
Wow.
Yes, which is a lot of money back then. And he had to have a mortgage. And Sarah Bates lent him the money to buy the land. We really want to know more about Sarah. She sounds so interesting. And how did she get all that money in 1785 as a widow? We'd really like to know more about her.
You know, how do you do your research? How did you get so much information about?
But I have an amazing group of board members and volunteers who are so excited by this project. Many of them are professionals in their fields. We have lawyers, we have professional photographers, and we have attracted some wonderful historians who are going through the many, many cartons of documents that we saved from, they were deteriorating in the house, and now they're in the Westchester County Archive. We had a PhD student from Yale come and do a finding aid, and they are now open for historians to review. So a lot of that information is coming from letters that have never been seen.
Could you tell us what we've done so far to restore the house or save the house?
Absolutely. First of all, I just wanted to say that the Friends of Odell House are a 501c3. As soon as Paul agreed to take ownership of the house, I applied for and got our nonprofit status. And then the town applied for and got a wonderful grant from the state, a matching grant that is allowed them to stabilize the house. It no longer has holes in the roof. It is no longer collapsing. They've done a marvelous job of preventing any further deterioration. And now we have Steve Tilley, who's a noted restoration architect, drawing plans for its actual restoration and how it will be used as a museum.
So when they restore a house that's a few hundred years old, if you want to be historically correct, there's certain things that you can and can't do?
There are certain things, and it's really decisions that have to be made, because while you want it to look the way it looked, you don't want it to be a perfect restoration because you want it to be used as a museum. So it has to have electricity. It has to have running water, probably. It has to allow people to walk through safely and be handicapped accessible. So you have to balance the two things.
The town is applying for another grant, which we should find out about pretty soon. Could you tell us about that?
That's another grant, hopefully, from the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. And if that second grant, which would be, the first was for $1.2 million, a matching grant, the town committed to half of that. The one we've applied for is another $1 million, which should really create the building in enough of a situation to be used as a museum. Now, none of that money can be used for the grounds. And the Friends have undertaken to plan and restore the grounds. So we were very lucky. We got a marvelous grant from a private family foundation, actually based here in New Rochelle, that has put us far along the way to do that. And we have donations of over $30,000 from private individuals. So it's not too late. The end of the year isn't here. If you want to have your tax donation, just go to our website. There's an easy button to push and support that. And then you can come and see the pathways and the outdoor classrooms and probably the cottage garden that would have been used. The farm was big. It had 200 acres. They raised sheep. They had prize apples. They're always bragging about their apples. We found a cider press in the basement that was used to make cider. And emptying this house was like a treasure hunt.
That's great. And this house is located on Ridge Road, right near Ridge Road Park, and right near Hartsbrook Park. So we have to take another break. There's too many breaks. And then we'll be back and we'll talk a little bit more about the Odell house and why this house is so significant. Otherwise, we would be saying, God save the Queen. And we would be, we'd have a prime minister. So I just want to ask before we start the break, if you could just go through the website again.
It's www.odellrochambeau.org.
Great. I'm Paul Feiner, Greenburgh Town Supervisor.
Now back to the Greenberg Report on 1460 WVOX. Once again, here's Greenburgh Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
I'm Paul Feiner. I'm the Greenburgh Town Supervisor, and my guest is Susan Seal. We're talking about the significance of the Odell House on Ridge Road in Hartsdale. This house is somewhat responsible for the Americans winning the Revolutionary War, as Susan mentioned before. And why, Susan, should people in New Rochelle and the Sound Shore and other parts of the county be interested in the house?
Why should they care? Absolutely. I think that particularly New Rochelle has a great association with this house because one of the extended family members of the Odells was Peter Bonnet. Peter Bonnet was a French Huguenot who came here to New Rochelle. He was a very wealthy man. He was also a slave owner. And we don't know what influence his ownership of slavery had on the fact that Colonel John Odell owned 4 slaves in 1800. And that's something we are really trying to research. It's not easy. There are very few early records, but I think the life of African Americans in the 18th and 19th century is extremely important to acknowledge and know more about. We want their story to be as much a part of it as the Revolutionary War heroes. There, I believe, is a politician here in New Rochelle whose last name is Bonnet. So if he's listening, I'd love to talk to you and find out more about your ancestors. We also are researching the Native Americans and many other topics. I have several projects ongoing right now with, again, our wonderful board. We have professional photographers, lawyers, everybody come and help. That's what this is all about. It is a county-wide project, and we're going to be finished, Paul, right, for the 250th anniversary in 2026. This is going to be one of the key places for that celebration in Westchester County.
And your website constantly is updated
Yes.
with interesting historical, articles.
We're also on Facebook, so definitely follow us on Facebook because we not only post our events, we also post those of RW250, which is the organization planning the 250th celebration in Westchester, and one of the biggest organizations already ongoing to get a good celebration here, commemoration of those events. There are a lot of other historic groups that we're working with, and they're on our Facebook page, and sometimes we'll put articles. And we have support from them. The Scarsdale Historical Society has been a supporter of us and is helping us with some of our expenses.
Well, one thing that I found really exciting a couple of years ago, the Consul General of France, from France, stopped by at the house,
Right.
and you took her on a tour. And she was like so excited.
Well, we
Why-
actually have the current consul general came this summer, and we were able to take him into the room where Rochambeau stayed. And I have to say, he actually had tears in his eyes because much of the French history was lost with the French Revolution. So the idea that there is a site in the United States that French tourists can come to and say, this is where our important ancestor made such a difference in the foundation of the United States, that's really important.
Right. And now, are they just excited, or do you think they're going to partner with
No,
their-
they hopefully are going to have some fundraisers for us. There's another group, with their help, I've been able to identify the names and the regiments of 4 French soldiers who died while they were in Greenburgh during the encampment, and they want to put a small monument to those soldiers. We're commemorating that, and we are working on commemorating the American soldiers. It's more difficult because they came from many different units, and there are a lot of different muster rolls, but we're trying to identify them and have a memorial to both of the American and the Continental and the French soldiers there.
So this effort that you're organizing, it could be really a real destination point.
Yeah, and I want a French restaurant in Greenberg, Paul.
I was just thinking of we had one at one
Right.
point, so it really is very, very exciting. You're not talking about just a crappy little museum. You're talking about a museum that students and history lovers will really appreciate. And even when you're talking about the significance of slavery is important, or information on the role of Native Americans, which
Absolutely.
very few people know about.
We're about to make a decision by the end of the war on an archaeological investigation of the project, because there are all kinds of stories that maybe there are Native American remains there, maybe there are French soldier remains there. We have boxes and boxes of pottery that has been dug out, and I know that there exists some bowls that were made by the Native Americans, so we're working with all those groups too to investigate that. This is not just one little house in the story of the Odell family. Even though the Odells were really important, every single generation fought in wars in the United States, from the Revolution right through World War II, including Edna, who was a nurse in France with the Red Cross during World War I, and we wrote a whole article about her, which is on our website.
I read that. It was fascinating.
Yeah. All the nurses in Westchester were very proud of her.
Right. How many stories how often do you update the website with different historical tidbits?
As often as we can. As I said, there are now over 16 cartons of letters that have been cataloged with a finding aid. So any historian who wants to research, particularly the 19th century, these letters are amazing. The Odell siblings of that century wrote constantly to each other. They wrote between Greenburgh and Yonkers, or Greenburgh and Dobbs Ferry. They would write 2 letters a day. One of the siblings, a man named Pierre Odell, was a good friend of Washington Irving's, and he wrote poetry, and they're in those letters. Another, Elizabeth Odell, was a concert pianist. She toured the American South with her grand piano in the 1840s and gave concerts. Her sister taught in Birmingham, Alabama in 1850. I mean, these are amazing stories. This is the story of America. They are really like the family to exhibit what it was like to live in 19th century America.
Wow. So that's really exciting. So when do you think the museum will actually, open? When do you think we could have our ribbon cutting?
I think you have to ask your departments that are overseeing all the construction, but I think we all hope that we could have at least a few rooms open by early 2023.
That's so exciting, really.
Yeah, not the whole museum, but there are actually 2 rooms that are not in poor condition. The 1855 section, which was built by Dykeman Odell, and it's a stone structure. And it's in fairly good condition, and it's a large space, so we might be able to begin to have use of it as an exhibit space.
What do you anticipate? Do you think the museum will be by appointment only, or do you think eventually it will be open?
I'm hoping that at least in the beginning we could have it open regularly 1 day a week, but we have to figure out, we'll have to have docents, and we'll have to have security, and it has to be accessible for everyone. So, we'll start with 1 day a week. Originally, my hope had been to coordinate this with the National Park Service site at St. Paul's. Now, that site is open 3 days a week, which is because it's, a national park site. So I think if we have it open once a week or by appointment, if a school group wanted to come. For the landscaping plans, I really want to have outdoor classroom space.
That is great. Well, you really make history interesting.
I want to.
That is great. We'll be right back after this break with Susan Odell, and the website is odellrochambeau.org, and you have to take a look at the website. And even if you don't think you like history, after you read about the Odell House, you'll start loving American history, and you'll realize how important this house is to Westchester County.
Maybe you'll find a musket ball in your front yard.
That's right.
WVOX.
Now back to the Greenberg Report on 1460 WVOX. Once again, here's Greenberg Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Hi, I'm Paul Feiner, Greenberg Town Supervisor, and a couple, maybe a few months ago, I thought I met George Washington, but I think it was your husband.
Yeah. No, he was Rochambeau.
He was Rochambeau.
Yes, David Seal as General Rochambeau.
So, is your husband as excited about history as you are?
Oh, he is totally my partner in this, and he's actually much more the professorial historian than I am. He's also our treasurer, so he's very good at keeping track of where the money is coming from and how carefully we spend it.
Yeah. Now, when I saw him on Colonial Day, and he was dressed up as Rochambeau, and there were people dressed up as George Washington. There's a lot of people who like reenacting the Revolutionary War. How come?
I think they want to remember our heritage, and they want to be sure that everybody understands what it was like to fight for independence. That was an extraordinary effort of people who just came with their rifles and volunteered. It was a tough 6 years. I mean, by the time that the French came, George Washington was writing to his closest friend, John Lawrence, "I am at the end of my tether," because it was 6 years. But we persevered, and people kept fighting. And That's what Colonial Day was about. Colonial Day, for our audience, was an event that the Friends organized in September of this year. It had been postponed 3 times because of COVID, but we had the 5th New York Militia there demonstrating how the soldiers marched, and they let children march along with them. We had people demonstrating spinning and a blacksmith, and then many people dressed in costume, and many of our local politicians came and spoke. And we'd love to do it again, but it's an enormous effort. So if there's anybody out there that likes to run events, please get in touch, because we want to keep going with this, and we hope that the grounds will be ready by next summer to have smaller events. But, we need help, so please volunteer.
Great. And there's a lot of opportunities for volunteers. And again, people could check out the website, odellrochambeau.org. Besides Colonial Day, what other events have the Friends sponsored?
We did sponsor some speeches. I mean, COVID really shut down a lot of things that we had hoped to do. But we are working right now on a project called the 1781 exhibit, which is going to produce a video. We have gotten some funding for that from the Hudson River Valley Greenway, the National Heritage Area, and we'll be producing a film probably somewhere in the area of 8 to 10 minutes long to educate 7th graders and adults about the events of 1781 in Greenburgh. Because, again, it's such an unknown story. Can you imagine that there were, between the 5,000 French and the 4,000 Continentals, there were 9,000 troops camped in Greenberg. It became the 3rd largest city on the eastern seaboard for that 6-week period.
That's amazing.
Yeah. I mean, and they had not just the troops, they had the cooks, and they had the men that drove the wagons, and the men that took care of the horses. And the French, of course, had to have their bread every day. So they built ovens, French ovens. Everybody always wants to know where they were, because they actually created, every Frenchman had to have a loaf of bread every day.
Wow, I never knew that.
Yeah. Through our property is a creek, and it's called French Creek, because we think that one of the ovens was near our house, near Sunnydale Golf Club. We're not sure exactly where. We'll find it. And they needed to have water to make the bread. So it would have been near a water source.
What, did the Americans have to have a loaf of bread also?
Oh, the poor Americans, they got hardtack, I think, and they got their own little provisions. They had very interesting ovens that they built where each soldier sat around in a circle around the oven and put his little pot in it and cooked his own cornmeal and whatever else the rations allowed him.
Wow.
There are diagrams of that on our website in the wonderful study that Dr. Robert Selig did about the French-American encampment. He has a lot of really interesting diagrams, how they laid in the tent, head to foot, and how many could fit in each tent. And it's really interesting.
So it really is interesting. And, as you're talking, it highlights that this is a story about America, not only about the Revolutionary War. And from when you get one bit of information, then it leads on to more and more and more. I was sort of thinking Greenberg started over a decade ago a Living History initiative where we've interviewed like 150 veterans of World War II and the Korean conflict, and they tell their stories. And wouldn't it have been fascinating if there would have been tape interviews of people who fought in the Revolutionary War?
Well, there actually are. There was a doctor, his last name was McDonald, and he realized sometime in the 19th century that these stories needed to be written down, and he interviewed a lot of the Revolutionary soldiers and officers. The McDonald papers are actually at the Westchester County Historical Society, and they're online, so you can find some of their stories written down. And then the soldiers had to apply for pensions after the war, so they were interviewed by people determining whether they were eligible to get a pension. So they actually told the stories of what battles they had participated in.
Oh, that is amazing. What got you interested in history?
Only recently. When I was in high school, history was all about memorizing dates. And I don't have a good memory for dates and numbers. I love the stories. So I think as I started to learn more about the Odells and the stories of this house and how it affected our entire country, I thought, wow, this is really something exciting. So I am an example of senior learning. I didn't know much about this until very recently, and it's humbling and it's exciting.
And it pays to move to a street that's named for
a French general,
yeah.
Right?
So if you lived on Carvel Street, you might have
yes,
worked to
Fudgy the Whale,
the Carvel
Tom Carvel and Fudgy the Whale, yeah.
So that's really interesting. Are there a lot of streets in Greenburgh named for Revolutionary War heroes?
That's a very good question. I know the Odell family because they were a vast family. By the way, John Odell's brother was the first town supervisor of Greenberg. His name was Abraham Odell, and I think you just surpassed him in the length of your term.
How many?
I think he was right up there with you, and I think now you're pulling ahead of him.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah,
So,
the first Greenberg Town Hall was on Route 9 in Elmsford.
Wasn't that Richard Brodsky's house?
Yes, and that was the first Greenberg Town Hall where Abraham Odell held meetings.
Oh, wow.
Yep.
So now I'm the longest serving
Yep.
town supervisor.
200 years from now, they'll talk about you, Paul.
That's right. There may be they could look at my bicycle.
I hope you kept all your records.
I have kept good records.
Good. That's really important.
And
Everybody should do that. Everybody should keep the records of their families. Don't throw anything out, but don't leave it in a big messy pile like the Odells did.
Is Greenberg doing enough to preserve current history, do you think? I mean, are local governments all over, say, Westchester, should we be doing more than we're doing now?
I think we are in an era of enlightenment, as it were. I think that, 40 years ago, a very close friend of mine became the town clerk for Eastchester. And she walked into her first office, opened a closet, and found 17th century papers lying on the floor. I don't think that would happen anymore. People are conscious of history and how important it is to preserve it. I think as Americans, we always thought, we're so new, we don't really have history. But
Right.
we do. We have great history. And if we don't learn history and learn how we persevered, we're not going to survive as a democracy. It's very important to understand how important our democracy is. And we need to understand how it was formed and continue forward.
That is great. We only have a few seconds left. Any other things you want to mention?
I do want to say thank you to you because you had the courage to take ownership of the house. And without that, we wouldn't have saved it. So that was really great. But I also want to say to everybody, please come and join us, volunteer and donate. Come to our website. And it's an easy button to say, I want to help.
Great. And we'll see everybody at the museum.
Absolutely.
And it really is going to be a tremendous county asset.
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you so much for what you've done. Without your help, we would not be preserving an important part of Greenberg history and American history. So you should be very proud of yourself.
Thank you for having me.
You're doing an amazing job. When you first started talking about this years ago, I never envisioned that the committee you formed would be doing such an amazing job.
Thank you, Paul.
Good. I'm Paul Feiner, and I'll see everybody next week.